In October 2024, a French court voided the dismissal of a truck driver who had refused to answer his employer's phone calls during legally mandated rest periods. The company called it insubordination. The court called it a constitutional right. France has a law that makes it illegal for your employer to expect you to respond to work messages outside contracted hours. It's actively enforced. It has cost companies hundreds of thousands of euros in damages. And it started with a 40-year argument about whether a 35-hour work week could actually hold. Rewind to 1998. France has an unemployment rate above 11%, higher than any G7 country carries today. The solution proposed by Prime Minister Lionel Jospin and his Labour Minister Martine Aubry was not more investment, not more retraining, it was fewer hours. The theory was called work sharing. Reduce individual working time, force companies to hire additional people to cover the remaining workload. Simple arithmetic. Politically explosive. 2 years later, the statutory work week dropped from 39 hours to 35. Law of the land. No exceptions for inconvenience. But the question no one fully anticipated, the one that would take 2 decades and hundreds of Supreme Court rulings to answer, was this. What happens to that legal limit when the office follows you home on a device in your pocket? Who exactly gets to define when work ends? That is the question this case built an answer to. The legislation came in 2 stages. The first law, passed in June 1998, was voluntary. The government offered employers generous subsidies, roughly 9,000 French francs per worker, equivalent to roughly 1,400 euros today, if they agreed to reduce working hours ahead of the mandatory deadline and hire at least 6% additional staff to compensate. The second law, Loi Aubry II, took effect on February 1, 2000, for companies with more than 20 employees. Smaller businesses got until January 2002. 35 hours was now the statutory cap, and the French labor code was rewritten around it. To prevent open revolt from employers, the government introduced a deal that would shape the next decade of French wages. 35 hours, paid as 39. Monthly salaries stayed the same for minimum wage earners. The state subsidized the resulting 11% increase in hourly labor costs. Workers got shorter hours, employers got state money. Trade unions signed agreements. By 2002, official estimates credited the reform with approximately 350,000 net new jobs, equivalent to hiring every employee at every hospital in France twice over. But wages stagnated. Multi-year wage freezes kept monthly pay static, while hours technically shrank. Economists coined a word for the effect: smicardization. A massive portion of the workforce drifted to or near the minimum wage and stayed there, frozen, while the reform claimed success on headline employment numbers. The 35-hour cap did not stop French executives from working 50 or 60 hours a week. The law anticipated this, so it created a workaround, one that would become one of the most heavily litigated loopholes in European labor history. It is called the forfait jours, the annual day rate contract. Here's how it works. Instead of counting hours, the employer and an autonomous executive agree that the executive will work a fixed number of days per year, capped by default at 218 days, with no hourly ceiling applied, no daily maximum, no weekly maximum, just days. In exchange, the executive accumulates RTT days, that stands for Réduction du temps de travail, or working time reduction days, as a form of compensatory leave. On paper, this makes operational sense for senior managers whose jobs cannot fit a standard schedule. The problem is what employers assumed they could skip. Before we get to what that cost them, there is something else you need to understand about how France enforces all of this. France's Labor Inspectorate, the government body responsible for enforcing working time law, does not audit paper records the way it used to. In the digital era, inspectors review VPN connection logs, email server traffic, and digital timestamp metadata to detect uncompensated hours that never appeared on a payslip. The French Labor Code places the burden of proof on this issue in an unusual way. An employee claiming unpaid overtime does not need to prove every hour individually. They need only provide sufficiently precise evidence: a personal spreadsheet, a log of email timestamps, screenshots of message threads. The burden then shifts to the employer, who must produce objective, documented time records in response. One former employee submitted a basic Excel spreadsheet. The employer had no tracking system and simply denied the hours. The Supreme Court ruled for the employee. Now, back to the forfaitures. For one of these day rate contracts to be legally valid, the employer must meet specific cumulative obligations. The day rate arrangement must be explicitly authorized by a collective bargaining agreement. Monthly tracking sheets must document the employee's workload. An alert system must exist for reporting excessive hours. And this is the specific obligation that destroyed multiple companies in court. The employer must hold at least one formal, individual interview per year dedicated exclusively to discussing the employee's workload, their work-life balance, and the effectiveness of their right to disconnect. Not a performance review, not a salary meeting, a workload interview. Documented. Annual. Mandatory. Many companies simply did not do this. A Zara store manager took her case to France's Supreme Court in 2022. Her forfaitures contract was invalidated, not because she worked unlawful hours, not because Zara had abused her, but because the company had failed to hold the mandatory individual workload interviews in 2010, 2012, and 2014. They had held them in 2011 and 2013. The gaps were enough. The Supreme Court threw out the entire contract and allowed her to recalculate her compensation on a 35-hour baseline, retroactively. In the Europe News case, decided in 2021, a former executive was awarded 350,000 euros in back pay and overtime, roughly the equivalent of 4 years of a senior French civil servant's salary. The employer could not produce written evidence of the mandatory workload interviews for a 5-year period. That documentation gap was worth 350,000 euros. One legal analysis of high-earning executives who successfully invalidate forfaitures contracts puts the total financial exposure at over 730,000 euros per case. That figure compounds quickly. Retroactive overtime premiums of 25% to 50% on every hour beyond 35 per week, compensatory rest payments for hours exceeding the annual contingent, and then the concealed work indemnity, an automatic 6-month gross salary penalty under Article L. 8223-1, triggered the moment a court concludes the employer intentionally omitted overtime hours from payslips. Non-negotiable, automatic. But the forfaitures problem was, in a strange way, the simpler problem. The harder one arrived when the smartphone put the office in everyone's pocket. French courts began addressing after-hours availability cases in the early 2000s. In 2001, the Supreme Court issued what became known as the Nikon ruling, affirming that employees cannot be compelled to transport professional files and equipment to their private homes, or to work from their personal address. In 2004, a follow-up ruling established that failing to answer a personal mobile phone outside contracted hours cannot constitute misconduct, not grounds for discipline, not grounds for dismissal, a protected refusal. France then did something no country had done before. In 2016, the government formally codified these rulings into statute as the droit à la déconnexion, the right to disconnect. Companies with 50 or more employees must now negotiate annually with trade unions to define the specific hours during which professional digital communications are restricted. If negotiations fail to produce a collective agreement, the employer must unilaterally draft a disconnection charter, outlining restricted hours, establishing training programs for managers on digital fatigue, and describing technical measures to reduce out-of-hours connectivity. France required corporations to put procedures for not working into writing, arguably the most French sentence ever written into employment statute. And then the litigation began in earnest. In 2018, British multinational Rent-to-Kill Initial lost a case brought by a former regional manager who argued that being required to keep his professional mobile phone permanently activated to handle emergency calls outside office hours constituted an uncompensated astrate, that is, a legally recognized standby period, which French law requires to be paid separately. The court agreed. Rent-to-Kill paid €60,868.51. In 2024, the case got stranger. A company called Tiller Systems was ordered to pay damages over a corporate WhatsApp group. Their sales director had created a team WhatsApp group and sent professional instructions and demands to staff during evenings and weekends. A former sales representative took it to court, not because the messages were abusive, not because she had been disciplined for ignoring them, because mandatory membership in an active work group that generated professional demands outside working hours was itself a violation of the right to disconnect. The court awarded €1,000, and in October 2024, the truck driver's case closed the loop complete. Here is what the French Supreme Court ruled. A truck driver dismissed for refusing to answer his employer's calls during legally mandated rest periods had been wrongfully terminated. Refusing to respond to work-related requests outside contracted hours does not constitute misconduct, even if that refusal was habitual, even if that refusal was against company culture, even if it had been done that way in the industry for years. The law is the law. The company had no legal recourse. So, what does the ledger look like after 25 years of this framework? France's 35-hour workweek did not eliminate long working hours. The average full-time French employee in 2024 worked approximately 36 hours per week, meaning the cap functions in practice as a floor for overtime calculation, not a ceiling on actual hours. But every hour beyond 35 now carries a mandatory 25% premium. Every employer who ignores this faces an inspectorate audit conducted with the same digital forensic tools used in financial fraud cases. The forfeiture cases prove that a single missed annual meeting is the difference between a valid executive contract and a six-figure liability. The disconnect cases prove that a WhatsApp group is a courtroom exhibit. The law France created at the turn of the millennium did not dramatically reduce unemployment the way its architects predicted. The 350,000 net jobs were real, but modest. The macroeconomic case for work sharing remained contested. What the law did instead was more durable. It drew a legal boundary between work and personal life. Then it spent 25 years defending that boundary with compounding judicial precision. Here is what this means if you don't live in France. You almost certainly work in a country where your employer can contact you at 11 p.m. and where ignoring that contact has professional consequences, where the line between the office and your kitchen table is a matter of company culture, not statute. That is changing faster than most people realize. As of 2023, Luxembourg mandated the right to disconnect across the entire private sector. Starting in July 2026, Luxembourgish employers who fail to establish a formal disconnect policy face administrative fines of up to €25,000, monitored by the National Labor Inspectorate. Portugal went further. Under current Portuguese law, a single SMS, WhatsApp message, or email sent by an employer to an off-duty worker can result in a penalty of up to €9,600 per message, not per pattern of behavior, per message. The French experiment dismissed as socialist overreach when it passed in 2000, treated as an economic curiosity by most of the Anglo-American business press, has quietly become the legal template that the rest of Europe is importing, one statute at a time. The next time a work notification appears on your phone at midnight, you may be living in a country that is one legislative session away from making that illegal. Here's a question for the comments. Should the right to disconnect be written into law where you live? And what do you think your employer would actually do if it were? If that question is still running in your head, subscribe. This channel exists for exactly that. Next week, we're examining the legal doctrine that allows a corporation to be charged with manslaughter. Not its executives, not its board, the corporation itself as a legal entity. And why, despite existing in multiple jurisdictions, it almost never results in a conviction. You'll want to see that one.